status used to be a very uncomfortable word for Labour, and now it's Reform that's using the word status, and now it's Trump. It wants to take its hands off departments of government, but at the other hand, it wants to spend a lot on people.
Reasserting the party's attachments to patriotism, to religion, might be a way to reconnect with these traditional Labour voters.
Blair works so hard to sort of take the party away from, its slightly union closeted roots. And now you've got Richard Tice, I mentioned earlier, saying, actually, you do have to help British industries.
The fact that Farage seems to be sort of being the Pied Piper and calling all of the shots. But that is because he is the figure who is exerting the political pressure. If there were an equivalent on the left, then politics right now would look very different.
Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the Newsagents live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at the Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th. Then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester the following week on the 24th. And finally, the Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of these dates. The link will be in the description below. And we're very excited to see you there. This is a video that's been released by the Home Office to show how tough the government is on cracking down on illegal immigrants and how if they're in the country without the right papers, well, they can be deported. It's all an attempt to show how muscular this government is in tackling the vexed issue of migration.
And it's opened up something of a rift in terms of how the Labour Party thinks it should respond to reform. Does it need to ape them or stand up to them? Does it need to be reform or tell reform it's wrong? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
And before we get on to the meat of the episode, we're in Birmingham next Monday at the Symphony Hall for our live show in association with HSBC UK. So if you're coming, please send us your questions and contact us at newsagents@global.com and you'll have the chance to put us on the spot in person in the Symphony Hall next Monday night. Limited number of tickets are still available for the show.
Those are the questions for Birmingham. The questions for today, perhaps the questions for the next 5 years, are going to be Labour's choice in how it responds to the Reform Party. And you may have seen an opinion poll last week, the first opinion poll, which showed Reform edging ahead of Labour, just minusculely by about 1 point, putting Reform ahead of Labour. And it's opened up a big conversation and maybe even a big rift in the Labour Party for how it responds to this insurgent party, whether it needs to be robust, muscular, push back, or whether it needs to start aping the sort of mechanisms and the messaging and even the policies of the Reform Party on the right. And we should put this in context, which is that Labour doesn't need to call an election until, mid-2029 at the latest. They have a long time to think about this. They have a very comfortable 170-seat majority. They have a broad coalition of seats. They only have Reform behind them in about 80 or 90 of those seats. So it's not like they are absolutely snapping at their heels now. But it is interesting that it's starting to make Labour pose a question to itself now, which is, do we borrow from Reform? Do we take their messaging? Do we take their language? Do we even take their colours in Facebook adverts? Or do we stand up and say, we've just got to effect change from inside government? We don't actually have to lean into, become the Reform Party.
Well, the remarkable thing in British politics, which we will be talking about, I'm pretty certain, over the next 5 years, is the extent to which reform is setting the terms of debate. Just as Trump is setting the terms of debate in America and has done, and that is affecting Western Europe as well, whether it be Germany, whether it be France, you name it, all those countries are feeling the same forces at play. And it's a feeling that the established way of doing politics has let people down, has left people feeling disillusioned, and therefore do you embrace the kind of concerns of people about, I don't know, illegal immigration or whatever it happens to be, or wokeness in America, or do you kind of stand up and say, I'm sorry, this is who we are? Now, it's really interesting. Diane Abbott has come out on the left of the Labour Party and made a very clear argument. Frankly, if we embrace reform, people will just go for the real thing and say, you know what, I'll vote reform.
All they're trying to do is placate potential reform voters. And my view is, far from placating people who are thinking about reform, it just reinforces reform's arguments and makes it more likely that people will vote for the real thing.
So countering that, of course, there are people saying Diane Abbott has to get with the plot now. She has to see what a threat reform are. And she has to recognise that if voters, whether they be Labour voters or non-Labour voters, are saying that immigration is a big issue, then Labour, the party of government, has to respond to that. I guess what's really interesting about this is that there are voices on the left in what they call blue Labour. Now, the blue doesn't stand for blue as in Conservative. Weirdly, it comes from blue as in the blues, the people who felt that Labour was kind of not helping sort of depressed areas, you know, the people who were down. And blue Labour believes that Labour has got to be the party of the working people, the voice on the left. It's got to be robust in challenging, for example, nationalisation, where it thinks that nationalisation is good. You've got Richard Tice, who is the Deputy Reform Leader, now the MP for Boston and Skegness, saying we've got to keep the steelworks open in Scunthorpe, right? Which is not a Tory policy. It's something very much of the left. You've got Reform saying if water isn't working privately, we've got to renationalise water. And I think Labour now has got to work out whether they are being attacked on the left or whether they've got to find their policies on the right. I think that's what's become a real challenge for the Labour Party right now. What I would say, though, is that they have got to be super careful with the narrative that just because Reform are surging in the polls, Labour needs to mimic them.
I think, though, that there are various areas where Labour is absolutely right to think that it has to be in touch with the concerns of its voters. And, you know, you go back to sort of Blair in 94 and he's the Shadow Home Secretary and he says we've got to be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. And it seems so self-evident now that you would say that. But Labour had previously had a narrative that people committed crime because they were from poor backgrounds and it was the system that made them commit the crimes. No, people had responsibility for what they did. And of course, for an awful lot of people living on housing estates where windows were getting smashed or their flats were getting burgled, this was their number one concern, not lofty ideas about democracy in Europe or whatever it happened to be. It was the bread and butter issues that people were concerned about. And I think that people who go up a high street and see the nail bar where it's cash only, because presumably there's a lot of money laundering going on, or the car wash where, again, it's cash only and it's sort of run entirely by immigrants who you don't know whether they're legally or illegally, people think, hang on, I'm playing by the rules, why aren't they? And I think Labour is right to be concerned about this. And I think that actually the release of that video today, which was kind of, you know, a bit ham-fisted, but you've got to show as well as tell. It's all right showing, you know, writing press releases that don't get picked up by anybody. You've got to show the video that you're doing things to demonstrate to the British people that change is coming.
So how far should Labour go to follow Reform on immigration? Because whatever Labour want to do or think they need to do, Reform will always want to grow harder. They had supporters back in the summer who were threatening to burn down hotels with immigrants inside. Now, Labour took a strong line against that back in July because they'd just been voted in. But you have to recognise that the Party of Reform is not just about immigration. It's about immigration plus. It's about immigration plus leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. It doesn't really want to take any refugees either. It's also about the party of dog whistle language. We've heard Nigel Farage in the past. We've heard the way he talks about sort of losing Englishness or losing Britishness. There is dog whistle language in that. What does Labour do when it comes to that? And I think they are opening up the door to something that ends up looking quite supine. If they're not careful, of course, you can say you want to control your borders. Of course, you want to bring the numbers of immigration down. Of course, you don't want to let, people who aren't paying taxes come here rent-free, scot-free, all the rest of it. But how far do they go down that line before they start losing who they are too? Because the voters can just choose reform if that's what they want.
Well, let's speak now to the Labour MP for Rother Valley, Jake Richards, who's also incidentally just come back from Germany, where he was looking at populism and the rise of Alternative for Deutschland and the rise of right-wing populism there, and maybe for the lessons that can be applied here. Let me just start with, we've had these Home Office raids on illegal immigrants, very performative, demonstrative, trying to show Labour cracking down, the government cracking down on illegal immigration. It looks like this is a response to reform, to almost aping reform in the way you're going about things. Is that the way to go?
Well, I think it's an absolute necessity to show the public that you take their concerns incredibly seriously and that you're acting upon them. Now, it's not the whole answer to this problem, but it's an absolute necessity. It's a step that has to be taken. I'm pleased the government are taking it. In Germany, one of the issues that I think the SPD have, the governing centre-left party, is there are still wide swathes of that party and that movement that simply will not face up to the reality that immigration is a major concern for people. So we had a conversation with a strategist in a progressive think tank in Berlin, and she said, people think immigration is a concern, but actually it's schools and hospitals. And that's the attitude which will lead to the devastating defeat that they're likely to face next week. This government and the Labour Party are taking a different approach. We appreciate that this is top three concerns for all voters and number one concern for many voters that are going to decide the next election. So we have to answer those concerns head on.
But I suppose the argument then comes back from people like Diane Abbott, which is, well, frankly, go for the real Reform Party if that's what you're just going to encourage people to end up in the arms of reform if you embrace their policies like that.
Well, I just reject that argument. I think the idea that you ignore what people are telling you is very dangerous, and we're not going to do that. And look, it's not just because we want to win people's votes. It's actually the right thing to do. Levels of immigration are completely unsustainable at the moment in this country. There is a consensus about that across the political spectrum. It's now how you deal with it. And this government today, they're bringing forward legislation which is going to go some way towards that, but it's only a small step forwards, and there's a lot more that has to be done.
Is it the language of reform that you think needs to be shared as well? I mean, this idea of it's a sort of odd video, isn't it? Because it sounds it's a sort of combination of sounding slightly violent and slightly sort of middle class in the same space. But do you think that reform is getting the language right on this? Is that what Labour wants to find?
Well, I think we have to understand how people's emotions. This isn't just a rational policy debate about numbers, about visas, about law enforcement. Of course that's important, and the bill today gets a lot of those details right, but we need to understand that people are worried and fearful and anxious by the fact that our borders seem completely uncontrolled, that we don't know who is arriving on our shores every day. That is a very scary and actually, frankly, completely unacceptable position to be in as a major country.
And some people...
I don't think some of that anger is shared by politicians enough. And people are angry about it. They think, frankly, people are taking the piss and that politicians haven't got a grip of it, and now we have to.
And some people were really, really angry, we'll remember, at what was happening last summer, and they felt so angry about immigration that they went to hotels and they tried to burn migrants in their beds. So I guess what I'm asking is, at what point does Labour just accept, the narrative that immigration is uniformly bad? And at what point do you go back and say, well, hang on a sec, we aren't going to be the Reform Party because Reform probably doesn't have a full stop anywhere on this. You know that.
Yeah.
So where does Labour find the muscularity, if you like, to say we can lead on this as well as listen?
Well, I think we have the massive benefit of being in government. So we can actually take action which hopefully will see results that then people will understand and trust that Labour get this issue and are dealing with it. Reform talk a lot, and there's a lot of bombastic talk, but I think that people recognise that some of that talk is simply unrealistic and is not going to work. One thing that I'm always struck with on the Rwanda plan, I don't want to go back to that, is that when you poll it, people say, we know this isn't going to work. But then you poll it again and say, do you support it? And they still support it. because they just want someone to do something. And they feel that the governments of all different colours over a 20-30 year period haven't got a grip of this issue. And I think that explains quite a lot of reform support at the moment, which is that people probably think, God, Nigel Farage, I don't really want him to be Prime Minister, but at least he's saying something, at least he has some ideas.
And you want to ape
pressure
that.
on. Well, we don't want to put we don't need to ape it. We need to deliver on it, because we have the benefit, as I said, of being in government. We're passing legislation today. We've actually have a very good record on deporting people who shouldn't be here since we've got to government, which we're beginning to communicate in some evocative and different ways, which I think is good and has to be done in this modern media age. And that's the answer for dealing with reform.
I think that one of the things that strikes me as well, just in policy terms, is why doesn't Labour embrace digital ID cards? Now, you can tell so much about you. Show me your ID card and you can see what their entitlement is. A lot of other countries have it as perfectly normal. Now, Blair has called for it, Blunkett has called for it, and I see you're now calling for it as well. Why isn't the Labour Party caught up?
Well, yeah, I've been calling for it for a long time, since the general election. For me, it's a really important policy development which will mean that we have better control of our borders, we can crack down on welfare fraud, it's better for crime prevention, but also public service reform in terms of patient passports, what's going on in the NHS. The reality is it is actually happening incrementally. So we've had an announcement that digital driving licence is going to be an outreach over the next few years. As I said, the NHS have got digital passports, e-visas in the Home Office. The Education Department have just announced new children's identifier for every child. But we need to bring it together, and we need it to be led right at the top of government as a national project over a 10-year period of what we call national renewal to rewire the relationship between the citizen and the state. I think it could be a pivotal part of it, and I'm calling for the government to do more and be more ambitious on it.
But you said at the start of this interview that the Labour Party is not like the SPD, where they're kind of talking just about hospitals and schools and not realising the Labour Party that you're a part of doesn't accept this either. The Labour Party as a whole is not for digital ID cards.
Well, let's see. As I say, I think there's a lot of work going on in this area. This week again, on Wednesday, the second reading of the Data Use and Access Bill. It's quite a dry piece of legislation, but it's actually making some really significant steps forward in this area. What I would do, and I've called for it today in an article in Huffington Post, is for someone in government and someone pretty senior in government to bring this together, to bring the public with us on this journey, because it's absolutely critical.
Well, Keir Starmer.
Well, yeah, the Prime Minister or Pat McFadden in the Cabinet Office. Well, because I think there is a lot going on in government, and there is a bandwidth, and there are certain things that you can lead on. I'm hoping that this is an agenda that the government will get a grip of and take forward, and I think they will. As you've said, this is happening across the world, and if we don't, then we're in danger of being left behind.
What about when you read Dominic Cummings' interview in the Sunday Times, where he says, look, the state has let you down. The state is responsible for so much that is crap in people's lives. Post office, blood scandal, Grenfell Tower, you name it. There are all kind of endless things you can point to where the state hasn't delivered, and you are in hock to civil servants who want the status quo, who want to keep things as they are. That is a critique from the right of British politics. I get a sense you share it.
Yeah, no, it's not a critique just of the right. It's a critique from the left, and that's absolutely critical to this. The Labour Party was created to be an insurgent on the institutions that are powerful, which are holding back power and wealth from those that also deserve it too. Where I think Dominic Cummings is right is the system is broken. We're talking about the rise of the far right across the Western world, and that is because the system, the economic model, the social fabric is broken and has failed people over a period of 20 or 30 years. So we need to go back to first principles on immigration, on the economy, on the health service, on education, to look at where we are as a country now, and not lean on a model which has failed people too much. And that's the radical change that people, I think, voted for back last summer, and this government has got to deliver on it. Now, it started doing that, but I do think we need to ask some more fundamental questions on all these issues.
Do you look across to Doge and think, yes, we need to be more Musk, we need to be firing more people, we need to be finding more efficiencies? I mean, is that a sort of the permission that America has now given this government?
There are certainly lessons to learn from across the government, and in terms of Trump's victory and then his time as president-elect and now as president, we're in a world now where chaos, urgency, rapid communications, different ways of thinking have to be embraced. Now, we keep our values, clearly, But at the same time, we have got to understand that the world is moving at a much faster pace than ever before. Technology is changing the way citizens and the state interact. And this Labour government will get caught behind unless it keeps ahead of it. And I genuinely think that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor get that. And they're trying to reform the way that Whitehall and the civil service works and get this done.
So just on that communication style, so Labour, the Labour Party, has launched a series of adverts with reform-style branding, sort of same colours as Reform. Facebook adverts include a series from a group called UK Migration Updates, boasting about how many people the government has deported. Adverts don't display the Labour logo, but as I say, similar to the colours used by Reform. Do you feel comfortable about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, part of what the Labour Party will be doing between now and the next election is telling the public about its record. And one of its
they might be telling the party about Reform's record if you use the same colour.
Well, I'm not sure about this thing about colours. I mean, I don't think Reform's brand is actually that developed across the country. Nigel Farage is very famous. I'm not sure Reform's colours are. So I don't think that's quite a fair criticism. But, it's about telling people what this government is doing, and it has deported a lot of people who shouldn't be here. And that's a good thing.
But why wouldn't you just do it with Labour insignia then and Labour colours? I mean,
you'd have to talk to the head of branding about that. There must be a reason behind it.
I know this was done by Yorkshire and Humber, so it wasn't necessarily central.
No. I mean, I think they're running in my constituency. I don't know actually, but
But don't you find it weird, Jake, that just to say, we know that the Reform colour is, it's a turquoise, not dissimilar to that. Funnily enough,
the newsagents are joining Reform. This is the story
we started
today.
First,
yeah.
But this idea that I guess it comes back to that question of muscularity. Like, either you believe in what you're doing and you believe you have a story to tell, or else you slip inside the colour of Reform because you want to sort of make people think that you are like them.
I think what you're getting at is a fair critique, which is that some of this means that Labour Party and the Labour movement more generally have to get out of its comfort zone. And for a lot of people in the Labour Party, talking about this issue is uncomfortable, or they don't like it. Well, I'm sorry, their time's gone now for those people in the Labour Party.
Who's that message to?
Well, I'm not going to name names of people.
Why
but
not? I mean, would you say to Diane Abbott, get with the plan?
No. I mean, I'd probably disagree with a lot of things with Diane Abbott, but I've got enormous respect for her, so I'm not going to criticise her on this podcast. But I do think that we need to recognise, and I think this is very clear that the Prime Minister gets this, that we have to meet people where they are on this issue. And we don't just have to do it to try and win their votes. We have to do it because it's the right thing to do. And I think that the government gets that, and vast majority of the Labour Party get that as well.
Do you think the SPD are just lost?
I mean, it was quite depressing. We're having meetings with them. Obviously, there's still 10 days to go to the next election, but it looks like they're going to finish third, and a devastating result. Through the German system means they could still find themselves in government as it happens, but they would be the junior partner if that does happen. But it's not good, and they're without any ideas because in my view, they haven't done this thinking outside of their comfort zone and caught up with the world as it is. Now, to be fair to them, Scholz has been Chancellor whilst there's been a pandemic and a war just a few hundred miles from his border.
So is Merkel wrong? Because I think this is relevant to what's happening here. She's accused the CDU leader, Merz, of basically turning his back on a previous pledge not to work with the AfD, the far-right party in Germany, because he supported a vote. Now, his response to her was, yours, get with it. Yeah. This is happening whether you like it or not. She said, don't give up our values, don't do this. Is she wrong?
Well, you have to be very careful. In Germany, there's a very different context on what they call the firewall, where they don't do any work with the far right, and the AfD would be counted as that. And I think in the German context, and the AfD and Reform are not, the parallels aren't exactly the same here. The AfD are legally barred in some states in Germany. They are far right fascists. I wouldn't call Nigel Farage and Reform that. So there is a difference.
Okay, would you be happy working with Reform on an immigration plan together then? Yes.
Yes, I mean, if I would work with anyone on an immigration plan, if they want to talk to the Labour Party about a plan to deal with our borders, to get illegal immigration down, then of course. I think what the CDU and AfD relationship and the difficulties it's causing CDU is a problem for Kemi Badenoch, because you've got an issue here with the Conservative Party that are completely torn between two different ways. Do they chase the Reform's tail, or do they come up with their own identity? The first 100 days of her leadership, she doesn't know what she's doing. She's confused, and I think that a lot of her MPs know that.
Parties, though, isn't it?
Yeah, and it is a challenge for Labour, but there's a particular difficulty for that opposition when you've got something to the right.
And Jake, you've talked a lot in this interview about how you need to communicate and the best ways to communicate. Are you on any WhatsApp groups where you're communicating your thoughts on your constituents?
I'm on lots of WhatsApp groups. And what happened over the weekend and Andrew Gwynn's WhatsApps were pretty disgraceful, and I was pleased that the party took action very quickly.
Should Oliver Ryan go as well?
I think there is a difference between what you say when you're an MP and being part of a group before.
Really?
Yes, I do. And I think...
What's the distinction?
Well, because you're not at that point an elected politician. I think Ollie has sent out a statement today saying he regrets some of the comments that he made. I genuinely haven't actually seen which comments he made or didn't. He was clearly on the group, and the party are launching an investigation. I think that's the right thing to do.
So he shouldn't hang, but Andrew Gwynn should?
Well, I think it's right that if you're an MP and you're saying things like that as an elected politician, it's pretty disgraceful. He's been sacked as a minister. He's lost the whip, as far as I understand it. It's been suspended as a member, and I think Ollie and that whole situation's being investigated too.
So, but you hope Ollie survives?
Well, I like Ollie, and look, it sounds like, and I genuinely haven't seen the messages. It sounds like he's said some stupid things and made mistakes a few years ago when he was younger. But I also believe in giving people a second chance as well.
Jake Richards, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Now, in the first half, I mentioned Blue Labour. It is this sort of grassroots group which has been going really for, 2 decades longer. It focuses on socially conservative values. It focuses on cultural issues at Labour's traditional base. And it is back in the headlines today because one of its key voices, almost founder, Lord Glassman, has called on Labour's Attorney General to go, saying he's essentially out of touch with how Labour should be treating its voters, talking to its voters, more importantly, listening to its voters. And just to give you a sense of who Lord Glassman is, he's somebody I think I've interviewed on Newsnight, probably not for a decade, not since we were talking about the ideology behind the Labour Party, but he is somebody who has been embraced by JD Vance, by Donald Trump. He's been invited to the inauguration. He was given cowboy boots when he was there, and indeed a cowboy hat, which I think he sort of quietly left to one side. He's been introduced to these people, not least by Farage, and he is trying to make the case that Labour needs to be much more in touch with the kind of voters that I guess you heard Jake trying to talk about a little bit earlier in this episode. And he is pushing back against the sort of more liberal, more progressive, more metropolitan side of Labour that we have come to sort of know really since the Tony Blair days.
Well, Maurice Glassman is also, like me, a Tottenham Hotspur supporter and goes all the time.
And if
he ever turned up at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium wearing a cowboy hat, I think he would be destroyed and credibility would be shredded in a second. If you think of the Labour Party, and the Tory Party regularly tried to depict it as such, as full of lawyers living in North London townhouses, Maurice Glassman is the antidote to that. He is not interested in it being a metropolitan, elite, woke party. He wants it to be a party that is in touch with ordinary people's values, that is talking about the issues that ordinary working class people are talking about, and not lofty ideals about international aid, about Europe, about court structures and those sort of things.
Blue Labour, as Emily said, this idea, which actually first came to some prominence, actually in the Ed Miliband leadership. I mean, Glassman was actually a friend of and a political ally of Ed Miliband. And it was this focus on the idea that basically, particularly in the New Labour period, Labour had become too rootless, too cosmopolitan, too comfortable with globalisation and the economic forces that were alienating people from more traditional values, particularly their community, patriotism and communitarianism, sort of more generally. And he's having this other moment, as Emily said, partly because he was invited to the inauguration, but also partly because within the Labour Party at the moment, there is this fear, as you've been talking about reform, and an idea that perhaps Blue Labour and these ideas reasserting the party's attachments to patriotism, to community, all of these kind of things, even to religion, might be a way to reconnect with these traditional Labour voters.
And I think the things that he's pushing for now are areas that we think of as really old left, sort of pre-Kinnock left, things like ideas of industrialisation. And what is interesting is, if you think about it, Blair worked so hard to sort of take the party away from, its slightly union closeted roots, its sense that it was all about the working man's club. And now you've got Richard Tice, I mentioned earlier, saying, actually, you do have to help British industries. You can't let them cave in. You do have to step in. And so this idea that actually status used to be a very uncomfortable word for Labour. And now it's reform that's using the word status. And now it's Trump that's trying to be sort of simultaneously big and small government. It wants to take its hands off departments of government, but at the other hand, it wants to spend a lot on people. And so you've got this really tricky conundrum, I think, for Labour now, which is, does it go back to something that feels much more protective, protectionist, anti-global, or does it kind of say we mustn't be buffeted by half-baked ideas from reform or half-baked ideas from Trump, which might be super popular, super trendy now, but aren't actually going to yield the results that we can if we stick to our, what has actually worked in the past.
But to be fair, this isn't an entirely new thing, because it's not as if Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer ran in the election, or that the intellectual direction of the sort of intellectual project of Labour over the past few years has been a sort of Blairite one, or a really globalist one. I mean, Rachel Reeves, while she was in opposition, developed the idea around securonomics, which was basically a version of Biden's economic plan, which was all about industrialisation. It was all about using the powers of the state to try and sort of protect these industries. So to be fair, things have already...
up to a point, but they're not stepping in when
they don't have the
steelworks
money.
closed down.
But they don't have the money, or partly it's around net zero and net zero commitments as well. So there are all of these sort of conundrums which are difficult. I mean, I think there's a sort of truth behind all of this, which is that, look, the reason Labour are looking to these ideas is because all of the political pressure that they're facing comes from the right. It's a really interesting thought experiment to imagine that if, and it's something we've talked about on this show before, and we've put to one of their leaders, if the Green Party or some other left of centre progressive force was doing even half as well or 2/3 as well as where Reform are, then suddenly Labour would be in the sort of strategic position that Kemi Badenoch finds herself in, which is that you've got political pressure from your left via the Lib Dems and the right. For anyone, if there is a
I guess the question is, would they be embracing net zero and green issues to outflank the Green Party?
Exactly,
right?
that's what I mean. So you would be having... you would have real political pressure on lots of issues that would be forcing Labour to protect their left flank. If you're wondering at the moment why it is that Labour are so interested in all of these ideas like Blue Labour ideas, or the ideas you've been talking about trying to ape reform, it's because fundamentally the political pressure on them strategically is only coming from one direction. So people, and I've had this conversation with people, and I know people listening to this sometimes get annoyed about the interest in Farage and the fact that Farage seems to be sort of being the Pied Piper and calling all of the shots. But that is because he is the figure who is exerting the political pressure. If that political pressure, if there were an equivalent on the left, then politics right now would look very different. We wouldn't be talking about Blue Labour. We wouldn't be talking about
I think
those
that's
things.
the problem is with the way Reform have positioned themselves is they will see themselves as the party of the right and the left.
Well, I mean on the sort of progressive left, forces on the progressive left.
It's definitely not progressive. So that's why we're talking about culturally conservative, right? So on the right, they want to go harder than Labour ever could on immigration. I mean, we talked about where they've positioned themselves in terms of stop the boats and all the rest of it. That's not the language that Labour's using. On the left, they probably do want to see government more involved. They do want to see government involved in sort of renationalisation, or at least they say they do.
I think it's a really great mistake to think just because Reform has said it, it is wrong. There may be many issues on which Reform are reflecting the concerns of an awful lot of people in this country who think that people have to play by the rules, obey the laws, come into the country legally. Yeah, I'm sure there are many people who find a lot of the language of Reform discriminatory, but that doesn't mean on everything. they're wrong.
I think there's a real danger that just because it's coming from Reform, you say it must be right.
No, I
because
don't
it's
think you
the
say
new
that
shiny
at
thing.
all.
No, but
No,
I'm
but
just
I just think that you start from a default position that anything that they're saying it's unacceptable, it's racist, whatever. There is a lot of it that is appallingly racist, but there are central ideas about illegal immigration, control of the borders, that I think speaks to an awful lot of people in this country.
Yeah, I think there is a real danger that just because Reform's saying it, we assume it's right, because Reform aren't actually interrogated in the same way that any of the main political parties are, because they keep on calling themselves the insurgent party or the disruptive parties. You know, they're not really interrogated on their plans for the NHS. They're not really interrogated on what they do about the economy. They're not really interrogated about what we do once we left the ECHR. None of these questions seem to really hit Reform, because all we talk to them about is why their plans for immigration are right and why the other party's plans are wrong.
I think what Morgan McSweeney, the Prime Minister's chief advisor, would say, and I think this is true and fair, is that there is nothing left-wing or inherently progressive about having a system where the rules are not enforced, right? There's nothing left-wing about that. In fact, it's the opposite, because a society, a sort of social democratic society, a collectivist society, relies upon a general sense from the population that everyone obeys and adheres to rules and obligations. So if you have people coming in illegally or whatever, or not obeying the rules, then it has to be enforced, and that actually reinforces progressive politics. But there is, I think, a really good, let's talk about, Glassman has mentioned the Attorney General, Lord Hermer. I suppose if you wanted to sort of set up two different approaches, or to look at an issue which kind of brings this issue to life, and you wonder where Keir Starmer comes down on it, is, you could take something along the lines of, there is a lot of frustration at the moment internally in government that, for example, Lord Hermer, who is the Attorney General, the government's chief legal officer, is advising all government ministers that they shouldn't even bring forward policy ideas, or civil servants shouldn't advise them on policy ideas that have any chance whatsoever of being struck down in the courts. Right? Now, this reverses a previous position that Suella Braverman had. And this is because his view would be that the government must always respect, first and foremost, the rule of law. Someone on Glassman's side, or on the more blue Labour side, would say what matters most is the nation state, and making sure that the nation state is able to do what they want to do most. Another good example, Chagos. So Chagos, if you're a Lord Hermer type figure and you're a kind of more liberal cosmopolitan figure, you'd say, right, we've got to obey international law. That's something that law, and therefore we've got to do this Chagos deal. You're on the blue Labour side, and you're saying, no way can we be seen to be handing £18 billion up to Chagos in the name of international law. That is not something that our constituents in the North or the Midlands or whatever will understand or accept. And in each of these issues, you can see that Keir Starmer, it is never exactly clear which side he will actually come down on, because by pedigree and by intellect, he's probably on the law, the legal side, the international legal side. But now he's talking about really the blue Labour nation state emphasis. So a lot of this, I think, ultimately comes down to confusion about where Keir Starmer himself sits.
We are now in a world, because of everything that Trump is doing, Musk's doing in the Treasury, Trump's doing to US aid, all the rest of it, we are asking the question of whether something's legal, and then kind of moving on as if that doesn't really matter. Oh, well, Trump's done it now. By the time the courts get around to it, it'll be 4 years on. It shouldn't really be legal versus political.
Well, I don't know. You can make the argument, and I suppose what Glassman and others are saying, and you do hit, there are ministers who would say this, is that, they would say it's government by lawyers rather than government policy.
Well, then you might as well have done the Rwanda plan and said it doesn't matter whether Rwanda's unsafe.
But
that's what the politics of the time demands.
No, but you can say that there is too much, that there has been, that for example, judicial review has become far more common. You could say that it has become more common for government action to be challenged in the courts, and that does sit uncomfortably in a system where ultimately Parliament is sovereign. And that is the kind of debate that's been going on for some years. Well, the good news is we finally got rid of John Sopel.
And the even better news is we have invited in LBC's Henry Riley, who's done some really interesting digging on a story that, just to put this in context, we asked the Labour MP earlier about Andrew Gwynn's tweets and the WhatsApp group, and we tend to give the party of government, naturally, a pretty hard ride on the things that are unearthed, and sometimes we don't always apply the same standards to the other parties in Parliament.
And this is, Emily, surrounding Reform UK. So I've been looking into one of their councillors. He is a councillor. Funny enough, he used to be Labour, then went independent and has now joined Reform UK.
I bet Labour were gutted to get rid of him.
Yeah, I don't think they were particularly happy. He's the leader on Torfaen Council, which, to put it in perspective, that's the only sort of council in Wales where Reform have an official grouping. So as far as sort of politicians of Reform persuasion in Wales goes, he's quite senior. He was also invited to open the Cumbraen Lidl last week as the official representative. I found out that he has a stage name called DJ Dowster. This is Councillor Dave Thomas, and we've been listening to some of the songs, so you don't have to, and they're extraordinary, some of the lyrics that are involved in this.
That extraordinary is doing a lot of heavy lifting
Yes,
for you,
well,
Henry.
Dr. Charlotte Proudman has described them as deeply concerning, degrading and misogynistic, and various other women's rights campaigners have told us they're shocked by them.
Let's hear them then.
I'll tell you what they are. So the first song is called Stomp, and still available on YouTube, Spotify. The lyrics include right in the and there's another song called Arse and Titties, and the lyrics say stanking arse that need to wash up, don't get mad when I don't want to and stanking is an informal term that I've learned that means something smells quite bad.
And what does Torfaen make of these songs?
I have put to some residents. I haven't had a response back just
You
yet.
get slapped around the face, I should imagine.
I've also asked Nick Thomas Simmons, who is the MP for the area, also a government minister. There are two other songs, if you'll indulge me, that I'll quickly tell you.
God.
There's the Titties song that has the lyrics, ladies, let me see you bouncing, all the ladies on the floor, grab your titties one by one, shake them around, let's have fun.
Henry, this is a school-run podcast.
Yes, there's a lot in here.
Well, it was.
Yeah.
He is actually a governor of his local primary school as well, this particular council.
Gosh.
You dropped that one in quite late in the day,
Yes.
I think
Not
I
so much
should say.
longer, I would imagine, Henry.
Sorry, I've approached them for comment, but circling back on Emily's point, these are, I mean, I feel quite uncomfortable reading them out, but they're really shocking comments from someone who is representing Reform UK in Wales. And I did put this to Reform, and they were very keen to stress that the lyrics themselves were not sung by the councillor, nor were they written by the councillor. They distanced him from the song, saying these songs were created by Sam Thompson and not Councillor Thomas. All lyrics are samples from other music tracks and artists. None originate from Councillor Thomas.
So wait a sec, what's the charge then? That he's been playing these in his DJ set?
Yes, and these feature very prominently in his songs, DJ sets, but also his official songs. And he's listed, I mean, they sort of said he wasn't that involved. The facts of the matter are he's listed as the artist of the songs and the composer. So they can say that he is not necessarily associated. Well, it is there in black and white. He is the only person that is DJ Dowster, and he is behind these songs.
So is your sense that Reform will sack him for this? Because I think this goes to the heart of, like, is Reform now a party that is acting as if it wants to be in government? Because presumably in the olden days, if they were, they would. What's the sense now?
Unless there is a stark change of approach, he will not be being sacked. I was speaking with a Reform UK source earlier on who was very bullish about these, saying that it's effectively creative licence, it's another career, it's a song. Some of these songs were from a couple of years ago. But that being said, he's been a councillor for a number of years. He defected to Reform last year, but very keen to stress the sort of distance between him and the songs, and so he's not going to be sacked anytime soon, unless I suspect this starts piling pressure in the media.
It's absolutely remarkable, Henry, to have someone in that chair who makes John Sopel seem relatively sanitised in his use of language. Congratulations.
I did feel like swearing in front of the teachers earlier on when I was...
well, you should be ashamed of yourself coming in here using language like that.
We're going to bleep your name.
Okay.
Bye.
We'll have to bleep the whole bloody thing. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.